The year was 2087, a year that marked humanity's boldest endeavor yet. The colonization of Mars. After decades of exploration, research, and preparation, the crew of Odisha spacecraft with cutting-edge technology and a hand-picked team of astronauts from around the world landed on the dusty red planet, ready to build humanity's first foothold on an alien world. Commander Elias, a seasoned veteran with years of space experience, led the mission. Despite the tension of interplanetary travel, spirits were high as they took their first steps on Martian soil. The first week was a blur of activity. The crew set up temporary shelters, unpacked the scientific instruments, and activated communication systems. Mars was a hostile but empty environment, they thought. A blank canvas that they would transform into a new world for humanity. Their main tasks included setting up sustainable food sources, testing the atmosphere, and mapping the planet's subterranean resources. So far, nothing had hinted at any life existing beyond what their instruments could detect. But as they unpacked their last container and prepared to run their first full system checks, something unusual happened. The communications officer, Dr. Leela Chang, noticed a strange signal on her monitor. It was faint at first, a steady hum that came and went, almost like static interference. But then the hum became rhythmic, almost melodic, repeating in a pattern that was distinctly unnatural. "Commander Elias," she called over the radio, "I think I've picked up something unusual." Commander Elias raised an eyebrow, walking over to her console. "Interference. It doesn't seem random," Dr. Chang replied, adjusting the frequency. "It's almost as if." She paused, struggling to put the inexplicable into words. "Almost as if it's trying to communicate." The crew huddled around the console, staring at the strange wave pattern displayed on the screen. It pulsed, faded, then returned, like a heartbeat, steady, unrelenting, impossible to ignore. Over the next few hours, they tried to trace the source of the signal. Sensors showed strange fluctuations originating from beneath the surface, miles below their base. Dr. Amir Vasquez, the team's geologist, theorized that the signal could be geological in nature, perhaps caused by some unique volcanic activity on Mars. But as they delved deeper, something alarming became clear. The signal was moving. "Commander," Dr. Chang said, her face pale. "It's following us." The strange signal continued to haunt the crew over the next few days, amplifying as night fell over the Martian desert. Every evening, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls of their shelter, making sleep nearly impossible. Tensions rose as theories clashed. Some, like Dr. Vasquez, insisted it was a natural phenomenon. Others began to fear that something more sinister was at play, driven by curiosity and the scientists' insatiable need to understand. Commander Elias ordered an expedition into the nearby cavern network that sensors had detected just below the base. Equipped with headlamps, survival gear, and handheld scanners, a small team descended into the tunnels, eager to solve the mystery of the sound and put their minds at ease. As they ventured into the subterranean labyrinth, the air grew colder, and the tunnels twisted in unnatural ways, their walls smoother than any naturally formed cave on Earth. Commander Elias began to suspect that they might be dealing with some form of Martian architecture, a remnant of an ancient civilization. Perhaps, the idea was thrilling, yet unsettling. What if there were remnants of life still lurking here? "Look at this," Dr. Vasquez whispered, pointing to strange markings on the wall. Symbols were etched in the rock, arranged in intricate patterns. They had no recognizable language, but there was a symmetry to them, something that suggested purpose. The hum grew stronger as they continued, vibrating through their bones. They followed the sound, feeling it guide them deeper into the darkness. It felt as though the tunnel itself was breathing, drawing them in, luring them toward an unknown fate. Finally, they reached a massive cavern. In its center were enormous crystalline structures, faintly glowing with a greenish light. They pulsed in time with the hum, casting an eerie, flickering glow over the cavern walls. The team stared in awe, their flashlights illuminating the strange sight, which felt more alive than any mineral formation they'd seen before. Dr. Chang approached cautiously, her hand outstretched. But before she could touch the crystals, something flickered at the corner of her vision. She froze. "Commander," she whispered, eyes wide. "We're not alone." Out of the darkness emerged creatures with a translucent, jelly-like skin that revealed shifting patterns beneath, almost like ink suspended in water. They moved with an uncanny grace, their limbs stretching and contracting as they advanced. Their eyes, a vivid green, locked onto the humans, unblinking and predatory. Commander Elias motioned for the team to back away slowly. But before they could react, one of the astronauts panicked, fumbling and accidentally dropping a piece of equipment. The sound echoed in the cavern, and the creatures flinched, their eyes narrowing, their forms hardening as they prepared to strike. "Run!" Commander Elias shouted, pulling Dr. Chang back as the creatures lunged toward them. The team sprinted, their footsteps echoing as they scrambled through the twisting tunnels. chased by the haunting figures who glided effortlessly behind them. As they neared the surface, one creature grabbed Dr. Vasquez, its limbs extending like tentacles, pulling him back. With a desperate swing, Elias managed to free him, and the team burst out into the open Martian air, gasping and exhausted. Behind them, the creatures halted at the mouth of the cave, retreating back into the darkness. But not before emitting a final resonant hum. The ground trembled slightly as if Mars itself was warning them. They had trespassed into forbidden territory. Back at camp, shaken and wounded, the crew tried to make sense of what they'd encountered. These were not passive life forms. They were dangerous, territorial, and alarmingly intelligent. The hum had followed them to the surface, louder than ever, a relentless, ghostly reminder that Mars was not empty. They hadn't landed on a desolate world. They had stepped into an ancient realm of predators, who had no intention of letting them stay. The Martian night crept over the landscape, casting long shadows around the crew's encampment. Inside the temporary shelter, Commander Elias, Dr. Chang, Dr. Vasquez, and the rest of the team gathered in a tense circle, the hum still reverberating in their minds. It was no longer just a strange background noise. It had become a warning, an unnerving reminder of what they had seen in the caverns below. "We need to assess what we're dealing with here," Commander Elias began, his voice steady but edged with unease. "These creatures, whatever they are, aren't just some natural phenomenon. They're territorial and, from what we saw, intelligent." Dr. Chang nodded, her fingers still trembling slightly. "They could have a complex society, maybe even a language. That hum could be a form of communication. They might be trying to coordinate or warn us." The tension in the room was palpable as the team debated their options. Should they abandon the mission? Try to communicate? But even as they discussed, an alarm blared, piercing through the night. "They're here," Dr. Vasquez whispered, his face pale. The crew rushed to the observation window, their hearts pounding as they looked out into the Martian twilight. Emerging from the shadows were the creatures they had encountered in the caverns, their forms shimmering under the starlight. There were dozens of them, spread out in a loose circle around the camp, their green eyes glowing with an unblinking intensity. Commander Elias activated the camp's defense systems, which included an array of lights and sound emitters designed to ward off potential threats. But as the lights blazed to life and the high-pitched sonic emitters sounded, the creatures merely tilted their heads, seeming more curious than intimidated. Then, one of the creatures extended a long sinuous limb, touching a piece of equipment on the outer perimeter. With a subtle shift, its skin emitted a low rumbling frequency. To the crew's horror, their equipment began to glitch, flickering erratically as if short-circuiting. The hum from the aliens resonated with the machinery, interfering with its operation. Within moments, their communications array went dark, cutting them off from any potential help from Earth. "Whatever they're doing, it's shutting us down," Dr. Chang gasped, frantically trying to reboot the systems. But nothing worked. The creature's hum was somehow interfering with their electronics, rendering them helpless. "We're sitting ducks here," Commander Elias muttered. "Grab any emergency weapons you can find. We'll have to confront them directly." The team armed themselves with makeshift weapons, plasma cutters, emergency flares, and any blunt objects they could find. As the creatures approached, Commander Elias held his ground, signaling for the crew to stand firm. But just as he raised his plasma cutter, the creatures attacked, moving with a terrifying speed that defied their previously graceful movements. Flares were launched into the air, lighting up the darkness in brief, fiery bursts. Plasma cutters sliced through the air, but the creatures dodged with fluid, unpredictable movements. Their translucent forms seemed to ripple, shifting in and out of visibility as they closed in on the humans. They weren't just attacking randomly. They moved with a precision that suggested they understood exactly where to strike. One by one, the crew was forced back, retreating toward the shelter. Dr. Vasquez attempted to communicate, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. But the creatures responded with a shriek that echoed across the barren landscape. They were not interested in communication. To them, the humans were invaders who had crossed into forbidden territory. With every failed attempt to fight back, the crew's fear grew. The realization was sinking, and these creatures were not just defensive, they were deadly. As dawn broke over the Martian horizon, the crew found themselves holed up in their makeshift shelter, barricaded against the strange, relentless creatures that now surrounded them. The aliens didn't retreat with the light of day. They maintained their eerie vigil, silently watching from a distance. The hum was ever present, pulsing with a menacing consistency that kept the crew on edge. Commander Elias gathered the remaining crew members, his face lined with exhaustion. "Our technology isn't working. Whatever frequency they're emitting is interfering with our systems. If we don't find a way to neutralize it, we'll be stranded here." Dr. Chang had been studying the hum obsessively, trying to analyze its pattern, its range, anything that might help them understand its nature. "Commander," she said, her voice tight with urgency, "I think I've found a way to disrupt their signal, at least temporarily. They seem to communicate on a very narrow frequency band. If we can create an interference signal that matches their frequency, we might be able to confuse them long enough to escape. Commander Elias nodded. Do whatever it takes. With limited equipment, Dr. Chang and Dr. Vasquez worked tirelessly, cobbling together a crude device that emitted a counter-frequency. It was a desperate move, but they had little choice. Every second spent in the shelter felt like an eternity as the aliens' hum grew louder, a psychological weight pressing down on them. As the crew watched with bated breath, Dr. Chang activated the device. At first, there was no change. But then, the hum faltered, its steady rhythm interrupted by bursts of static. Outside, the creatures seemed to freeze, their forms flickering, their coordination disrupted. They shifted unsteadily, their movements erratic, as if struggling to communicate with one another. It's working, Dr. Vasquez whispered, a note of hope breaking through his fear. Commander Elias didn't hesitate. Everyone, get to the rover. This is our chance. The crew scrambled into the rover, leaving behind the majority of their supplies. Their only objective was to reach the Odyssey, the spacecraft that had brought them to Mars. If they could make it, they might have a chance of lifting off and escaping the planet. The hum continued to stutter in the background, creating a dissonant echo that followed them as they sped across the Martian landscape. But as they neared the landing site, the interference began to weaken. The aliens were recovering, their forms solidifying once more in the distance, and their hum returning to its original, menacing resonance. The crew drove faster, the landscape blurring around them as they raced against time. The Odyssey loomed ahead, its sleek form promising salvation. They reached the landing site just as the creatures closed in, their shrieks piercing the thin Martian air. Dr. Chang and Dr. Vasquez sprinted toward the airlock, fumbling with the controls as the rest of the crew held off the advancing aliens with the last of their flares and plasma cutters. With a final push, they managed to seal the airlock, cutting off the creature's approach. The crew collapsed inside, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling with the exhaustion and terror of the past few hours. As they prepared the ship for launch, Dr. Chang looked out the small window, watching as the creatures regrouped below. Their eyes glinted in the early morning light, watching in a manner that seemed almost aware. It was as if they understood that the humans were leaving, but they would remember. Commander Elias set the coordinates for Earth, his hands steady but his gaze dark. They had barely escaped with their lives, but the mission had failed. Mars was no longer a new frontier waiting to be colonized. It was a hostile world with inhabitants who had made one thing abundantly clear. Humans were not welcome. As the Odyssey lifted off, the hum faded into silence, replaced by the quiet void of space. But the memory of it lingered, a haunting reminder of the alien life that lay waiting on the red planet, a life that would not be disturbed again. The Odyssey soared above the red Martian surface, its engines rumbling as it broke free from Mars' thin atmosphere. The crew, battered and exhausted, slumped into their seats, relief settling over them like a heavy blanket. They had survived. But as they looked out the viewing ports, the barren landscape below seemed to stare back with a silent, menacing promise. They may have left, but the memory of what they'd seen would haunt them forever. Commander Elias initiated the post-launch procedures, his face set in a grim expression. Dr. Chang, Dr. Vasquez, secure any data we've gathered on those creatures. We need to warn Earth about what's down there. The crew nodded, knowing that their experiences needed to be shared. Mars was not a place for human expansion. Not now, and perhaps not ever. As they reached low orbit, Dr. Chang began compiling the data they'd recorded on the creatures and the strange frequencies they emitted. She discovered something alarming. The hum, though faint, was still detectable in their equipment. Even from orbit, the creatures' signals lingered, a ghostly resonance that seemed to chase them even as they left Mars behind. It's like they're trying to follow us, Dr. Chang murmured, unsettled by the persistence of the frequency. They're not just protecting their territory. It's almost as if they're aware of us. Individually. Commander Elias frowned. Can they really reach us all the way up here? Dr. Vasquez shook his head. It shouldn't be possible. Mars' atmosphere is too thin for sound to travel that far, and we're outside the range of any known biosignals. But this is something else. Just as they thought they had escaped, the lights in the cockpit flickered. A low hum echoed through the ship, impossible, yet undeniable. The frequency had somehow breached the Odyssey's systems. Instruments began to glitch, screens flickered, and their navigation controls spasmed, throwing the crew into a new state of panic. Commander Elias grabbed the control panel, his voice sharp. Chang, shut down all non-essential systems. Vasquez, can you isolate the frequency and block it? But no matter what they did, the hum persisted, growing louder and more chaotic. It felt as though Mars itself was reaching out, refusing to let them leave. The crew scrambled to contain the interference, their hands moving frantically over the controls as the hum grew into a deep, resonant pulse, a reminder of the threat they had tried to escape. Dr. Chang looked at Commander Elias, her face pale. "It's like they're inside the ship." The hum intensified, and in a moment of desperation, Dr. Chang activated the device they'd used to interfere with the creature's signals back on the Martian surface. It was a crude, hastily made tool, but it was all they had. As soon as she powered it on, the hum wavered, and the ship's systems stabilized. Relief flooded over them, but they knew this was only a temporary fix. "We need to get away from Mars' gravitational pull," Commander Elias said, gritting his teeth. "The faster we get back to Earth, the better." As they sped further from Mars, the hum finally faded, leaving them in an eerie silence. The crew sat in stunned quiet, the weight of what they'd encountered settling heavily upon them. They had left Mars, but the experience was seared into their minds, the hum echoing in their memories like a dark, foreboding reminder. Dr. Chang turned to Commander Elias. "What do we tell them back on Earth? How do we explain this?" Commander Elias leaned back, the exhaustion clear in his eyes. "We tell them the truth. Mars isn't ours to take. Whatever lives there, it's not just surviving, it's thriving, and it's ready to defend its territory." Back on Earth, scientists, politicians, and media would clamor to hear their story. Some would call them heroes, others would label them as fearmongers, but the crew would stick to their message. Mars was not a frontier to be conquered. It was a place of alien life, fiercely territorial, intelligent, and deadly. The hum would become a symbol of warning, a haunting sound that would resonate in humanity's collective memory. As the Odyssey neared Earth, the crew's thoughts drifted back to Mars, to the creatures who had stared at them with those cold, intelligent eyes. Mars was no longer the red planet of mystery and possibility. It was a world with inhabitants who had sent a clear message. Humanity had come too close, and it would not be welcome again. In the quiet of the spacecraft, the hum faded completely, but the silence left something even more chilling, a promise that if humans dared to return, they would be met with a force as relentless as the Martian storms.